Well, good evening. I'm Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Detroit Public Television, and I want to welcome you to this special screening of Pathways to Prison, a Detroit Public Television documentary. First of all, tonight I want to thank WKAR and Michigan State University for hosting us here tonight. I think you're going to enjoy this documentary. I hope you find it informative and thought-provoking, and I know at times you're going to find it disturbing. And at its conclusion, we're going to talk about the things we saw and the things we felt with a panel of key public leaders from Michigan who are involved in this issue, as well as members of this community. So stick around for the panel discussion. I think you'll find that stimulating as well. This is a kind of dialogue on crucial topics that only public television is equipped to do and is increasingly doing it on a variety of platforms, including social media. So I want to take a minute before we get started with the film to let you hear from two of the people who are making that possible in Michigan. We'll hear first from Rich Homburg, President and CEO of Detroit Public Television, and then Susie Elkins, Director of Broadcasting and General Manager at WKR, Michigan State University. So Rich?
Good evening. We're really thrilled to be here. As you may have read, a year ago we announced a partnership with Michigan State University to do some work in Detroit around building a kids channel and then sort of sharing that with WKR and bringing it all together and to look for new opportunities for public television. If we've learned anything over the past couple of years is big shows are important, but just as important is the conversation and the dialogue and really staying with the issue. And where we're headed as an organization, I think WKAR is how do we take on important issues where you need us to light it up for television, but also bring you into the conversation. So after we aired the Pathways to Prison doc, it just seemed natural to bring it to Lansing, partner with our sister station, and then bring you into the room for a discussion about this very, very important issue. So glad to be here, thrilled at our partnership, and we feel like we're just getting started. Glad to be at Michigan State today. So thanks, have a nice evening, and here's my partner, Susie Elkins.
Thanks, Rich. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Rich, and thank you, Nolan. I just want to say on behalf of our Dean, Prabhu David, and our staff here at WKAR and in the college, we'd like to welcome you and say how honored we are to have you all here with us tonight. I really want to thank Rich and his team for partnering with us on the screening of Pathways to Prison and congratulate them on producing such an important film. It's important for us to bring this documentary to the Capital Region and host this discussion because it's central to our mission. We often host this kind of screening for our own programming and with partners, and I think the most important thing is to, as Rich said, have that conversation, especially when it's a crucial topic like this one. It's really important to discuss with our own communities and with the decision makers in the room and to really have that thoughtful conversation so that we can move forward together. I'm excited to hear from our panelists, and I'm excited to have this conversation with all of you tonight. And I just want to mention this will air on WKAR on May 9th at 9 p.m. And I believe you all got an evaluation for this evening, too. That's always really important for us. We always make sure we put out an evaluation so you can let us know what we got right, what we didn't get right. If you'd like to see more partnerships like this, I also want to say on behalf of WKAR how important this partnership with Detroit Public Television has been for us and I think for our community. We can open up content between their market, our market, share ideas, share conversation, and that's always good for audiences and good for the community. So thank you so much for your partnership, and thank you all for coming tonight.
I'd like to introduce now our host for the conversation, Senator John Prose, who's going to offer a few opening remarks before we get to the documentary. As a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Senator Prose serves as the chair of both the Corrections and Judiciary subcommittees. In those capacities, he spearheaded a package of bills through the Michigan legislature calling for reforms throughout the criminal justice system. Among its provisions, the package limits the time that a probation violator would serve for technical violations, allow judges to shorten the probation period as a result of good behavior, and provide incentives to probation agents and supervisors to keep those probationers from coming back to prison. The legislation received bipartisan support and was signed into law by Governor Rick Snyder on March 30th. Senator Prose grew up in St. Joseph and has served as that state senator for that community since 2010. He received a bachelor's degree from the Marquette University in Milwaukee, and then had the good sense to come back home to Michigan State University to get his master's degree in higher education administration. Please welcome now State Senator John Prose.
Thank you, Nolan, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here this evening to have the kind of dialogue that certainly will be elicited because of the conversation that you see in the presentation from Detroit Public Television. They did an excellent job of identifying some of the concerns and some of the issues that surround this very complicated topic. And as we kind of kick off this discussion, for those that are not within this space necessarily, or have experience and understanding of a portion of this space, you have to envision the challenge that I had with Representative LeGrand and others in the legislature, which is to better identify what it is that we're talking about. When I first entered into some discussions about how we might solve some of the criminal justice problems that we have in the legislature, the response that I got from my Republican colleagues and my Democrat colleagues, I might add, was very clearly that they looked forward to prison reform. I can't wait for prison reform. I had to remind them that, in fact, nearly every budget of the 18 fiscal budgets that we have in the state of Michigan in various departments has a role to play and is, in fact, envisioning criminal justice as a portion of its expenditures. To simply say that we're looking at criminal justice as a line item in a budget then dismisses, of course, the human toll and the human impact that we're facing as it relates to those that are on the victim side of the equation and communities that are then less prosperous, less safe, more of a concern for our communities in terms of growth and development. But we also recognize, too, that offenders have an ability to reform, and we should be considering reformation as a part of the suggestion, as a part of the way that we do the budget that we do on an annual basis. So if you just look at the question of a criminal justice timeline, if you will, that timeline, of course, begins quite young in some cases in our juvenile justice side of the equation. So I started to begin to build a case with my legislative colleagues in a broader understanding of what you will see in a moment is that impact at a portion in that process. The prison side, the parole and probation side of the equation. But if you take that timeline, you can imagine that we can make significant differences if we put into practice some of those best practices that occur in other states. After all, in your civics class, you go back, you remember the federalism side of the equation says that while the federal government can give us lots of great ideas, the states are the great incubators of new ideas. And that's really what we have sought to do, is to take some of those best practices in other states. And we had stakeholders, in fact, one of those stakeholders will be with us, Barbara, in just a little while in the panel, had a great deal to say. In fact, she's a star in the show too, so you'll see her in just a moment. But I will tell you that discussion of those 18 bills that passed into law and the 21 bills that were envisioned, a couple got vetoed. We're going to work on that. Representative LeGrand and I have some work to do. Justice McCormick, you'll see her in a moment. We have some work to do on some of these other bills. But I'll tell you, there has been a fantastic opportunity that's been realized by the governor's stroke of his pen. And that opportunity is to put into practice some of those best practices that stakeholders across the spectrum had a say in making a difference in criminal justice in Michigan. So we know that we can see a better outcome on the back end. Perhaps an evidence-based outcome. Seems logical, seems reasonable, but providing for evidence-based practices gives us the ability to understand success or failure when it comes to funding programs, funding issues, finding solutions to new legislative action that may make an even greater difference. And after all, don't we want safer communities, fewer victims, and fixed people who are otherwise committing crimes in our communities? And by fixed, I mean that 75% of those in our prison system have mental health issues, drug issues, or issues related to other substance abuse, alcohol, for example. If we recognize that as the case, we know that our judiciary is a big part of that process. And as Justice McCormick will identify, we see the judiciary engaging in a whole new way in our state today. Problem-solving courts are becoming not just something unique and different, but are becoming very commonplace throughout our counties. That is a good move in the right direction, where the judiciary is engaging in a way to try to make a difference in this criminal justice space. So imagine having our family court work on our juvenile justice side of the equation in a bill that we passed into law last year, the consent calendar. What does that mean? It means we don't have to adjudicate a child who is a juvenile with an immediate sanction and being brought before the court in such a way that they then become criminalized at an early age. Instead, if all agree, including the victims themselves, agree that this juvenile ought to have the opportunity to come before the court in a private setting, and the prosecutor agrees, everybody's on board with giving this young individual a second chance, we might do very well in offloading what could be a future life of crime. These are small solutions that have huge impact, and I'm very proud to have worked with my legislative colleagues in the House and the Senate. So when this aired, Nolan, none of these bills were signed. We hadn't passed them through the legislative process, so keep that in mind, and we can talk about some of those details in our panel discussion coming up on how we hope that the signature of the governor, the bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, give us the best opportunity for success in evidence-based practices, in fixing people, in ultimately having safer communities and fewer victims. And that means a more prosperous Michigan overall. Enjoy the presentation this evening. It's an honor to be with each and every one of you, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. And now, Pathways to Prison. Again, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. It certainly has given us a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. So I would like to invite our panel up now to continue this conversation about pathways to prison. Panelists? No assigned seats. Just sit wherever you like, and there's water under your chair. So we've put together what I think is a pretty strong panel to continue this discussion. We're going to get them to talk about some of the things we just saw and heard, but we'd also like to hear from you. So as this conversation goes on, you have a question, raise your hand, somebody will bring you a microphone, and we'd like you to participate in this conversation as well. So let me introduce our panelists and then get started. Again, we're joined by Senator John Prose, a Republican from St. Joseph. Next to him is a man we saw featured very prominently in this presentation, Yusuf Bunchi Shakur, founder and CEO of YBS Consulting. Barbara Levine from the Citizens Alliance on Prisons and Public Spending, who was also featured in the film. Thank you, Barbara. We have everybody's favorite Supreme Court Justice, Bridget McCormick, is with us tonight. And Representative David LeGrand, a Democrat from Grand Rapids. So welcome to our panel. So Yusuf, since you were such a key figure in this movie, I want to start by asking you, as you think about your own pathway to prison, what might have happened in your life to change that course? before you ever got to that prison cell?
So this morning, me and my coworker was in New Center area, right next door to Midtown in the Tubman building, and there was an exhibit, and it had multiple pictures of all this redevelopment that's about to take place in this two miles. And on the pictures, one that said 52 million had been invested, 12 million had invested, 1.6 million had invested, and in total probably 200 million. But you go to the east of that area is my neighborhood, a neighborhood of poverty, a neighborhood of drugs. And we haven't seen, besides the 50,000 that we raised last year to invest in this community. So that same money that we're investing in other communities, that we're invested in the community that need it, it addresses crime and addresses prison immediately. So it's a matter, everybody's in an uproar about when people say Black Lives Matter, but it's historically we have not mattered because we have not been invested in this country in terms of our human development, besides being invested in sending us to prison.
So we approach corrections, Yusuf, if we can stay with this, as a matter of changing individual decision-making. And you're saying we need to start with changing communities and the dynamics that children grow up in.
Absolutely. When you look at any community, particular as far as the large portion of individuals who come out of these communities, the social and economic levels of these communities collapse. Well, I mean, what else you expect from them to do? You don't have to go to Harvard to figure this out. If you get somebody, if I don't get an honest job, I'm gonna work a dishonest job.
Right.
I mean, this is, talking about generations that has been sentenced to poverty. Then you throw in what the 13th Amendment says: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist except as a punishment for a crime. So the same amendment that's supposed to abolish slavery actually legalized slavery. So in terms from a racial dynamic, it has set up Black people and brown people for failure in this country.
So, Senator, you're working on sort of the other end of the policy making in terms of trying to make the correction system work better for both the state, for society, and for the inmates. Your package of bill, the Senate's package of bill that the governor signed in at the end of March, how is that going to address some of the issues we saw in this film? How's it going to make the system work better for both the inmates and for society?
That's a great question, and the question that you previously asked, Mr. Shakur, that this package doesn't necessarily talk about poverty and the issues of poverty and some of the systemic issues of poverty. So I don't want to dismiss that very important question and how that relates to some of the legislative action that happens in Lansing and the work that we do. You shifted just a bit, Nolan, to the question of the package of bills and how this may impact better outcomes. In fact, the intent is to insist upon better outcomes within the Department of Corrections, to insist that the programs that are within inside the walls during prison time are effective and evidence-based. And a lot of the question that was brought up in the piece that we just saw too was related to that earliest release date. And part of the incarceration time that individuals are given, it includes coursework that's required in advance of them being prepared to go before the parole board. And the Department of Corrections has the responsibility of ensuring that those particular programs are given and that are completed successfully in advance of that date that they go before the parole board. So that can have an impact if for some reason there is a stack up of individuals waiting for that coursework in advance of their time before the parole board. So we're looking to have this package of bills, as it's being implemented now, just recently signed, to insist upon outcomes in the Department of Corrections that allow for the greatest success for individuals who will return to the communities which they came from originally. So we're hopeful that we see those outcomes be evidence-based and better.
But we heard Mr. Shakur say in the film that nothing that happened in the prison system that the corrections department was responsible for helped him. What helped him was that time with his father, which was sort of coincidental, I imagine, not intentional. While you were serving your sentence, during those years you were in prison, did you get any of the things you needed to succeed on the outside from the correction system itself?
I mean, by the time I went to prison during the 90s, you're talking about an overcrowding situation, individuals who are, this long line just to get into school to get a GED. By that time, Engler snatches all the, not recreational, but educational programs. So it was all about, self-interest. And I was fortunate enough that my father had laid a pathway of redemption. Only other program that was mandatory, which was a SARTA program, which was not provided at every prison. So you had to be at a particular prison, but also in particular for a reform or eradicating of allowing folks to get out, you have this prison guideline score. So I was denied 4 times. 4 times, and in the first 3 times, it was slid up under my door. And what I couldn't change was the offense that I was convicted of. So I had to do more time. But the guards who saw me every day, why won't they let you go? You're a model prisoner. You haven't had a fight in 8 years. So again, are we really looking at the individual and measuring the transformation, but also we're just warehousing individuals. And you warehouse an individual where criminal behavior is being fostered, and when you and anger and hostility, and you're released back to a community, perpetuates that same cycle.
Representative LeGrand, clearly the job isn't done, the job of corrections reform. You've got in the House another package of bills. One of the things it deals with is what Mr. Shakur was talking about, and that is presumptive parole, letting people out when we say we're going to let them out rather than keeping them in longer. Why is that such a hard measure to get passed?
Well, it hasn't been reintroduced yet, so we'll see how hard it is. From my perspective, and I've got to say, a lot of what Senator Prose has worked on, frankly, has been getting rid of some gross irrationalities in the parole system. So holding parolees to a completely different standard than we hold the rest of society to. So a minor infraction for me might send me to jail for 7 days, but it could send a parolee back prior to these bills for a couple years to prison. And that's just irrational. And so it's setting people up for failure. I look at this, and again, we've touched on this, but maybe you look at this whole system as either a river or as a whirlpool. There's a whole lot of complexity here. And so I really focused, when I was on the Grand Rapids School Board, on reducing suspensions and expulsions in Grand Rapids schools, and we did that with a program called Restorative Practices. And that is something that already in Lansing now, I've passed a series of laws that suggest that restorative practices should be our discipline model of choice statewide. And study after study shows that can massively drop the number of suspensions and expulsions. And your film pointed out very well, I think, that, and I always say, if you send a 9-year-old home to an empty home, that's immoral. If you send a 15-year-old home, it's just stupid. I mean, I know what I would have done if you left me home alone for 10 days without supervision when I was 15. I would have done something dumb, and then I would have been halfway to prison.
You're making the justice very nervous because she's got an 18-year-old at home alone.
Well, right. I mean, and especially this is true for men. I mean, my joke is my 23-year-old son is actually younger than my 17-year-old daughter. Men don't get all their brain cells till they're 24. We know this now. Well, okay, yeah, maybe 40. So there's a lot we have to do, and it's not just poverty, it's also the education system. But I am right now focused on trying to stop one of the things that is a huge stumbling block for people, and that is our cash bond system. You heard the statistics about how many people in America can't afford a $500 problem in their life. Well, if you're charged with something and you can't make bond, think about where that puts you. That puts you in a situation where in a couple days CPS is coming for your kids. Within a couple days, you probably lost your job. Within a couple weeks, you probably lost your housing. And so there are 8,000 people in our jail system right now who are there simply because they can't afford to bond out. Those people, and I'll tell you this as a former defense lawyer, if I'm having a conversation with a client and there's an offer on the table of credit time served, we're not talking about guilt or innocence anymore. People are just, they're ready to get out the door. They'll say, I'm a hippopotamus. What did I do? Remind me what I did so I can tell the judge. Because people want to get home. They want to get home and take care of their families. They want to get home and take care of their obligations. And so people, unfortunately, are confessing to things they didn't necessarily do. They're getting sentences that they don't necessarily warrant. And that is another huge stumbling block in the path that sets people up to go to prison. Because if you get a misdemeanor, it shows up in your sentencing guidelines and you look like a worse person. So if you take a misdemeanor, it's the first sort of stumbling block that can lead to a whole series of failures down the road. So there are points that we have to look and see, where are we failing? Right now, I think we're failing our kids with our discipline models in schools. I think we're failing people who aren't rich with our cash bond system. We're failing people in our prison system with guidelines that are too high. And we're failing people who are in the prisons by not really supporting them in prison, but also in reentry. And there's just a mountain of work to do. And we all know this, but there's just a mountain of stuff to do. I mean, there's more stuff than I'm going to have time to do in my 6 years in Lansing.
Justice McCormick, you've spent a lot of time, and your court has, on this issue of if you're poor and you're convicted of a crime, which many of the people convicted of a crime are poor, and you lack the cash to sort of pursue justice, you fall further behind in the system.
So I'll answer your question eventually.
Okay.
But in the meantime, we've seen and heard about what might feel like insurmountable problems, and I want to sound some good news. And the good news is Senator Prose and Representative LaGrand are working together on solutions to these problems in a way that I feel like this is one of the very good news stories in government right now, that we have leaders willing to say, let's make sure that we're making decisions across all of these systems that intersect. We've seen how they intersect in ways that both make our communities safer. The ideas that Senator Prose is bringing to the table are making sure the people who get out are going to be able to contribute to their communities and are going to make sure their communities are safer. But we're going to do it in an evidence-based way, which ties into what Representative LaGrand was saying. In addition to the cash bond problem affecting the people who can't pay the bond, and this is kind of, I'm almost answering your question, Nolan. Yeah. It actually relates to what Senator Prose has said, because we want to make smart decisions about who is in our jails and for what. So if someone is picked up for driving with a suspended license and they can't pay the $500 bond, because $500 to some people is too much to pay, and the jail therefore lets out somebody who's actually been convicted of a violent crime but is serving a sentence in the jail, because that happens, well then our communities are not safer by making decisions that we're not using evidence-based tools to make. Now, I'm in a branch of government that doesn't make these decisions. We actually just help enforce the decisions the other branches make, and so it's actually not—
It's their fault.
So, but no, I'm here to say I feel excited. No, I think it's their good news. It's the good news that they are working on these, and we are excited to be the front lines of partnering with them to make them work. So for one good news story example is, over the years, the legislature and Senator Prose in particular have been extremely helpful to us, or supportive of our problem-solving courts throughout the state. This wasn't 20 years ago thought of as a good way to do business. We thought, well, we're spending more money. Well, it turns out we're saving more money, because the success rates of the people who go through those courts are significantly higher than people who go through regular courts. And so our communities are safer when they return and actually get employed. And we've been very excited about being the branch of government that actually gets to put those policies into action. And we are eager to also be a partner in some of these next steps in the criminal justice reform bills that I, as an individual, not in my professional role, am happy to see, I think, a very good news story in government.
Ms. Levine, we heard you say on the film that you talk about the number of people Michigan locks up more than our neighboring states, and we keep them locked up longer. These specialty courts that Justice McCormick's talking about, the efforts to try to find alternatives to prison, is Michigan doing enough in those areas? I mean, it seems our fallback position is always lock them up.
Well, I think in all fairness, Michigan has been a leader in trying to, for some years, in trying to push more low-level offenders out of the system. So what you've got in prison now is sort of two extremes, and then this bunch in about a third in the middle. At the low end, you've got about a third of the population serving minimum sentences of 2 years or less. But it's because they've got long prior records. So you've got people who have come back to prison over and over again on relatively petty offenses, often as a result of mental illness or alcoholism or substance abuse, and everybody sort of throws up their hands and says, we've tried everything else, there's nothing to do but send them to prison. And we have to look at that percentage of the population and say, what's the point? We've tried this before, it clearly hasn't worked, and is it worth it? At the other extreme, about a third of the population are serving very long sentences. And that happened over a period of years as part of the whole Get Tough movement. And our sentencing guidelines actually were deliberately designed to push more low-level offenders out of the system, but to increase the length of time that more serious offenders are serving. And one of the policy decisions we have to make is, when is enough enough? And what is the point of keeping people for years or decades beyond the time they present any risk to the community? And where would that money be better spent? I mean, the documentary is really gut-wrenching in terms of looking at these kids growing up in war zones, with very little, without anybody telling them that they're valued, that they have a future, that they can do something besides go to prison. But it takes money to address that, and it would be not very hard to adopt a combination of strategies that could shift maybe $200 million out of the prison system into the sorts of programs that would actually help keep those kids from going into the prison system. One of the points, though, I think that has to be borne in mind is one of the policy choices that was made was to deinstitutionalize the mentally ill, and now you've got the criminal justice system as sort of the mental health provider of last resort. 20% of prisoners and an even larger percentage of jail inmates have a history of serious mental illness.
And I would ask our lawmakers, that seems to have turned out to be a disastrous decision, and it would seem prison is the absolute wrong place to treat mental illness. Are you all taking up this issue? Are you looking at better ways to deal with the criminally mentally ill?
Indeed. In fact, the budgets that we're working on just today and in the House of Representatives yesterday, both of those budgets envisioned some innovative programming to try to address, in particular, the mentally ill and the mentally ill that are also then a part of our incarcerated environment, too. And as I mentioned in my outset, if you remember, Nolan, too, we're talking about individuals in that criminal justice timeline that intersect into virtually every budget in the state of Michigan in some way, shape, or form. That isn't universally known. It isn't universally understood that that's the case. So the work that we're doing right now through the Department of Health and Human Services budget to try to address that staffing issue, to try to address the de-escalation that can happen between police and local communities, to train local community law enforcement officials on how to address and understand the impact of an individual that presents themselves or that they're called to pick up because they have an order from the court through the community mental health system. And in fact, some work that's being done to try to take the community mental health system and to make it also more effective. There are state and federal dollars involved in all of this. And it is as Representative LeGrand said, it is a multifaceted problem that does not have an easy and quick solution, but you start at the beginning of what you can try to address, and that's really why we've tried to look at best practices in the juvenile justice arena. That was a significant portion of the documentary that we just saw. The juvenile justice work that we do today holds the best promise for success in the future if we do well on the front end before they begin to present those kind of mental health issues that could otherwise be devastating to the long-term impact of all 18 state budgets.
Oh, have I got a mic? Yeah. So let me echo and amplify that a little bit. One of the things, I knew Senator Prose and I were going to get along great because one of the first things he did was he pulled out a chart and said, look, the real cost of incarceration isn't $2 billion. And he had it all worked out, and he had it more like $7 billion, you think, is the real number we ought to be talking about, not $2?
The best that we could identify was across all budgets, and this is no federal dollars, by the way. I need to make that clear. This is just state dollars, our tax dollars at every level. The best that we could identify, because we don't have complete data, but the best data that we can identify is 5.6 billion annually in criminal justice across that whole timeline, not just prison, but across the whole timeline.
So one of the things that one of the numbers, I don't like using the 42,000 number either, because we got 18,000 people locked up in our jails. So I like talking about 60,000 people locked up in Michigan at any given point. So mental health, first of all, of course, and I think we both are enthusiastic about rolling out mental health courts, because they're a great idea and they work. And interplay with other services is a great point. One of the counterintuitive ideas that I haven't had time to drop a bill on yet is I actually want to get rid of the maximum amount of time you're allowed to keep someone on probation. That's counterintuitive, but I have had clients who I could have gotten a misdemeanor offer for them because everybody around the table knew that there was a mental health issue involved in their charge. But the prosecutor said, well, I can only keep somebody on probation for a maximum of 2 years if they get a misdemeanor. So, and I've had clients where everybody around the table knew that that person had a mental health issue. It was going to be a lifetime problem for them, a lifetime challenge. We needed them monitored out in the community. So everybody wanted something that looked a lot like probation, someone to come along, walk alongside them, check up on them, make sure they were med compliant. But that tool wasn't in the toolbox. So counterintuitively, I actually want to get rid of our limits on how long people can be on probation, because I think that's a tool that's needed for people with mental health issues. The final thing I'll say is I can't speak to every county, but one of the things about Kent County, I practice in the adult system and in the juvenile system, and I would say to people all the time, I wish the adult system was just like the juvenile system, because in Kent County, if you have a juvenile kid who has a problem, they throw resources at it. So they get the kid counseling, and they get him. They figure out how to get him a mentor, and they check up on them to see if they're in school. And if they're playing hooky, they put them on a tether. And there's an escalating series of things they do. But basically, they throw more and more and more resources at that kid. And if the kid keeps acting up, they send them off to get a brain assessment and see what is the underlying problem with this kid's brain that's making them act out these ways. And the system just keeps hugging that kid. And I've seen kids who I wouldn't have bet a nickel on them turning into a productive member of society when they were 11. And by the time they're 18, they are gentle, interesting, engaged members of society. And I've seen the years of services that can produce these amazing results. But in our adult system, our basic message is, we're done with you. We're tired of talking about this. You screwed up. Go away. Our basic system of dealing with people with problems is go away. That's the adult system. Unfortunately, that's our basic system in schools too, right? That's what suspensions and expulsions are. It's go away. I don't want to think about you. Go away.
So, Ms. Levine, once we tell them go away, what are we doing for them when they are in prison? It seems like the corrections system should have two goals. One, punish the people who have earned punishment, but also to rehabilitate the people that we send there. Are we doing enough on the rehabilitation and the preparation for returning to society?
I don't think there's any question that it would be desirable to have more and better programming in prison. It's a resource question. You have to be willing to invest that. Inevitably, prisons, the first goal, the first requirement for prisons is custody, it's security. And so, you've got an enormous budget that's devoted to employees who are there to make sure people don't escape and don't hurt each other. And programming is always the stepchild in a secure facility like that. The Department of Corrections is certainly trying some innovative programming. It's got its vocational village, for instance, in Ionia, where it's working more closely with employers to do realistic job training that will transition into actual jobs for people. It's trying to do some innovative programming to divert people who are not doing well on probation. But part of the problem has always been that required programming for, say, assault of offenders or sex offenders is not even delivered until very close to the end of somebody's sentence. You can be serving a 15-year term and not get anywhere near programming until you've served 14 years, which is, if it's workable programming, you'd think you'd want to have people get it early on, but it's always a question of resource allocation and the availability of trained staff and psychologists to do it. So, that's certainly an issue. But some people, you still have to recognize that the majority of people who get out of prison are not going to reoffend, no matter what happens to them inside. Partly because they've grown and matured, because they've had the experience of prison and don't want to go back, but also, and it's counterintuitive to people, but the very offenses that people are most afraid of, the offenses that are most serious, murders, sex offenses, other assaultive offenses, actually have far and away the lowest reoffense rates. And what we do is we've gotten so punitive, and our idea of what's a reasonable sentence has gotten so long over the last few decades. And now we're paying the price because, you know, if you sentence somebody who's 18 to 40 years in prison, guess what? You've got a 58-year-old that you're paying for at the other end, somebody who's very, very low risk and is starting to, you know, have the health issues of old age. So,
Senator, you talked about this huge cost beyond that $40-some thousand per prisoner. Why not invest more money in retraining or training people for life after prison, or training them to get out perhaps, excuse me, earlier than the sentence might have allowed?
Well, unfortunately, the budget that has, well, for several years now, we've been reinvesting some of the savings that we're seeing in a decrease in the prison population overall, significant decreases, in fact. The 42,000 that was listed that are currently incarcerated in Michigan prisons continues to be declining. And in fact, this budget, February to February, is down 1,600 prisoners. It's expected that will be by October 1st, the beginning of the new fiscal year, close to 1,800 to maybe 2,000, and by the beginning of the next calendar year, as many as 2,200 prisoners. That equals the potential of closing facilities. When you close a facility, you have an ancillary benefit of the financial side of the equation. So what we've done in the Senate budget that we hope to pass on the Senate floor tomorrow, I never want to count my chickens before they hatch, but the intent is to pass the budget that takes a portion of those savings and reinvest them into programming such as an online skills training program for high school equivalency. There's a pilot in the budget that I'm putting forward tomorrow before the full Senate. There's also a reinvestment in some of the bills that just recently passed and were signed into law, Nolan, that give us the chance to give our parole and probation agents on the front door probation, on the back door parole, the kind of incentives to be able to allow them to work very closely and directly with an individual that has a particular need. So if we continue to provide a one-size-fits-all parole and probation system in the Department of Corrections, then what is needed in a Benton Harbor community or a St. Joseph community like I represent, or a Niles community, may not be the Detroit community's needs or the Marquette's needs or the Kent County's needs in Representative LeGrand's district. But that parole agent knows what they need. So let's give them the tools to do so. And one quick point to this. We have 100,000 people under supervision in the state of Michigan through the Department of Corrections. 42,000 in our prisons, the rest on probation and parole. Of those 100,000 people, part of the bills that we passed address that cycle of failures on probation and parole by putting some limits on it, giving some best practices to parole and probation agents, and investing some of those savings in that opportunity so that we don't have 50% of our annual commitment rate as failures on probation and parole.
But you don't yet address presumptive parole in this package, right?
If we prepare an individual for parole, once they go before the parole board, they're going to receive their parole. 90% of those that go before the parole board that don't receive it at the first date, 90% of them within 6 months are paroled, as was in fact the individual that was in the documentary.
I want to ask Mr. Shigura, somebody who's been in prison, looking at that release date, when the release date comes and you're still in prison, what does that do to the individual?
I mean, you're overwhelmed. You're excited. There's anxiety. But also you're going inside, or need to go inside and examine. You may look at someone who hasn't seen their family members in 10 years, who hasn't had any meaningful contact in 20 years. You know, whether that's letters, whether that's phone calls, and now you're expected to come home and make a transition back into society. I mean, from yesterday to today, it's changed. So imagine in 20 years for someone who may face literacy issues and et cetera. And again, you're setting this person up to failure, but also we're not looking within the structure, too, of racism, the structural racism that plays a great role in the discrimination process of folks getting locked up, as well as maintaining these people while they're incarcerated. So we're going to talk about reform, we're talking about change. It has to happen on both ends for justice and equity to really happen.
Justice McCormick, Supreme Court returned some discretion in sentencing to judges when it knocked out the U.S. Supreme Court, and when it knocked away some of the mandatory sentencing practices. If judges had more ability to deal with an individual inmate based on the circumstances of both the crime but the individual, could we have a more effective justice system?
So this is a question that there are lots of strong feelings on all sides of. And there are great arguments for why sentencing guidelines actually produce, more predictable sentences across different courts, counties, judges, and you could imagine what those good arguments are. There are also good arguments for judicial discretion and permitting judges to be able to take into account the factors of an individual in a crime to make sure that the specific punishment fits the crime. The constitutional ruling that you're talking about was actually one our court issued as well as the U.S. We did hold the Michigan sentencing guidelines unconstitutional, although we felt that we need to respect the legislature's choice as much as we can, so we told judges to still look at them. But we don't write the Constitution; we just apply it. That is what it is. But having said that, I think your question is how can judges make better decisions? And again, I don't mean to always be like that there is some good news here, but I really feel myself like there's a lot of good news here, because what I believe what the packages Senator Pruz has been working on are bringing evidence-based decisions to our courts so that judges can actually make the decisions that actually make sense, right? So I mean, if you're a judge and you can have good information about whether someone is likely to come back to court, for example, if you're making a decision about whether to release them on bond or just release them on their own recognizance, or you're making a decision about sentence, the more information you have, the better evidence you have, the more likely that's going to be a good decision. So again, I'm very optimistic that by looking at the criminal justice system, the way we look at any other regulatory system, right? I mean, with that much money at stake, why wouldn't we try and make sure we're spending it well, right? Why wouldn't we say, if this is medicine or aviation, for decades we've been figuring out how to manage risk with data, with evidence. Why wouldn't we do that with the criminal justice system as well? I mean, landing planes is important. Things go wrong. Well, things go wrong when we get it wrong in the criminal justice system too. So it's good news. It's a good news story.
Ms. Lee?
Can I just briefly respond on presumptive parole?
Yeah.
Throughout, and in response to even the sentencing guidelines questions, the criminal justice system is just at every stage rife with discretion. And so the issue from police to parole boards and at every stage through is always how do you strike the balance between having the discretion to recognize the facts of individual cases, but having some structure that doesn't allow for discretion to be abused, and that promotes consistency and fairness. In the parole system, since 1992, there have been parole guidelines. And the prisoner gets scored. Once somebody's eligible for release, they get scored on a variety of factors that largely tend to predict whether they're likely to reoffend. And the statute has said all that time that if somebody scores a high probability for release, meaning that they're at low risk for reoffending, they are supposed to be released at their minimum unless there are substantial and compelling reasons not to release them. The problem has been the phrase substantial and compelling is not defined in the statute, and individual board members have a tendency to interpret that as they want to, and that often comes out to, I don't care that the judge only gave you this for that offense. I don't think you've done long enough. It's not stated that way, but the reasons given come out to boilerplate of, as I said in the piece, lacks empathy, lacks insight. So what the bill would do is simply, would simply define what are substantial and compelling reasons to create
One of the
consistency.
bills that addressed that in the criminal justice package that passed and was signed by the governor specifically requires the parole board to provide information and data as to why. Right now, we don't have that. But to quantify in a quarterly report, now you say, well, what's the use of reports? Well, reports give us the kind of data that Justice McCormick was just referring to, that then give us some trajectory of understanding what it is that the Department of Corrections may not be providing in that preparation for the earliest release date and the parole hearing. And so we're trying to marry together that data today with the success of offenders tomorrow.
Okay. Well, we have time for some questions from our audience. Right here, can we get a mic front row?
One quick comment and then a question, if that's
Sure.
okay. So I approach this through 3 different lenses. I am the daughter of a federal prison inmate. I work in early intervention, and I serve as a trustee on a local school board. So first, my comment is there's a very well-researched prevention tool, and that is funding preschool for everybody in the state, for everybody in the country, really. My early intervention program ends at 3, and for many of our kids, they're not going to get anything else till they go to kindergarten. So that's 2 years that they're floating around out there. And so when we want to look at prevention dollars, it's really a great, it's a good, you get a lot of bang for your buck by fully funding preschool. My question is, I've spent lots of time visiting my father in prison, and I know that contact visits, being able to hug him and touch him and spend time face-to-face with him has been huge for all of us and has proven to help with recidivism, with reducing recidivism. And I know that there's this movement now to privatize visitation, and that visitation is now in a lot of prisons being done through video. And in fact, to the degree where people who may live 10 miles from the prison are being denied the right to have contact visits with their inmates there. And so I don't know what's the rationale for that. Is that anything that's being addressed?
Yeah, so let me take this to my personal history, which is I'm a lawyer, and so I could go out and visit my clients, and I still could get contact if I had a client in the Kent County Jail. But I've also been preaching in the Kent County Jail for 17 years now, and it makes me furious to go out there now because a couple years ago, the Kent County Jail stopped letting families have face-to-face contact. And so you literally go out to the Kent County Jail and you can use a computer screen at the jail. You may as well stay home. You could be Skyping from Omaha, right? It makes me furious because I know the data you're talking about. There's no rational reason we don't want to let people have contact with their family. It's good, it's not bad. It's the reason people have an incentive. It's what gives them hope. Back when I was a prosecutor, the feds came into the Kent County Prosecutor's Office and they were trying to sell us on a program with no sense of irony they called Project Exile. And it was designed to take people who were in their community and move them as far away as possible during their sentence. And at one point they said, and they were telling me how they were taking these scary people, and they had this one guy who they caught with an 8-ball, and they had this other guy they caught with marijuana, and they had this third person. And eventually I raised my hand and I said, okay, you told me this was for dangerous folks, but all those 3 cases you just told me about were just drug cases? And the Fed said at the time, this is years ago, said, oh yeah, drugs and violence, they're the same thing. So that's our war on drugs, folks. I'm absolutely with you. Anything I can do personally to bridge that gap and to allow families to have more contact with the people inside, the happier I'm going to be. One of the things that makes me furious again, or did make me furious when I was still working in Kent County in abuse and neglect cases, was judges who would routinely deny children any ability to see their parents inside because they said it would traumatize them. Like, I'm a parent. I'm also a child of parents. I can't imagine a planet on which if you had an 8-year-old kid and you had you were trying to balance the choice of not seeing your parent versus seeing them in a cinder block room, that seeing your father in a cinder block room was a worse alternative than not seeing your parent at all. But that's what's going on right now in the abuse and neglect system. Well-intentioned judges in the juvenile system are actively banning letting children see their parents, and I don't understand it.
That's a trend in this video visit, is a trend in county jails that's primarily for jail management purposes. It's more convenient for the jail. It's a staffing issue. You don't have to staff visiting rooms. That's not something the Michigan Department of Corrections is doing. It only limits contact visits to certain maximum security prisoners or people who are in segregation.
Mr. Shakur, the importance of that sort of contact to an inmate.
It's essential, again, someone who's been incarcerated and you've been sent away and say that you're going away pay a debt to society, and that debt is continuing to be heaped upon you. And it's like, anger, and it's continuing to be fueled. And that angry person is going to not be released to the community of the folks who are perpetuating that anger, but released back to another community. And we wonder why the crime that they continue to commit is the fact that you've released a hostile individual. And the greatest hope that a person can have is the love that they can receive from their mother, from their father, from their children.
Over here.
Yes, when you were talking about schools and restorative practice, would you speak more to some of those schools that actually claim they implement restorative practice, but actually don't implement it, but yet still young people actually end up getting kicked out because they don't follow the rules, but those who implement it aren't implementing it properly?
Honestly, I don't know how to answer that. I'm not familiar with schools that, I'm sure just like with any system, there are systems that promise something and don't deliver it. I can tell you that systems where it really does happen, you can see substantial reductions. So in Grand Rapids, we've been using restorative practices, and we've seen back-to-back double-digit reductions in the number of kids we suspend and expel. When I got on the school board in Grand Rapids, we were suspending, it was a 16,000 kid system, we were suspending and expelling 3,000 kids a year. We've cut that almost in half just in the couple years since we started, and that was before I left to come to Lansing, and that's still going on in Grand Rapids, and I'm excited by that because there's all kinds of data from all over the country. A well-implemented restorative practice program will do exactly what they were talking about in the videos. It takes the time to figure out what's going on in that child's life, what the stressors are, why is that child acting out, and this is a huge problem, particularly in communities with children of color, because as the video pointed out, this is a nationwide problem that kids, African-American children particularly, are usually suspended at 4, 5, sometimes 6 times the rate that Caucasian children are, and it's not for specific things like getting in fight or smoking. Turns out white kids do that just as often as black kids do, but the black kids get disproportionately suspended for things like being disrespectful, having a bad attitude, and then you're halfway to Jackson, right? So it's a huge problem that we've got to deal with in our school system.
Another question over here.
Yes, Nolan. My name is Willie X. Harris. I am the chairman of the Michigan Lifers Association. I spent 23 and a half years in the state prison in southern Michigan for a murder I never committed. I went in at age 17 in 1956 and got out June the 4th, 1980, and I've been out now 37 years. Now, during that period of time, the Michigan Parole Board had an interest in the rehabilitation of a prisoner. Right now, there is no interest. They flop you and don't give you any reason why they flop you, and they tell you we have no interest in you, continue as you're doing, and that the gravity of your crime is such that you don't merit any consideration at this time. My question is, don't we as taxpayers pay the Department of Corrections to have an interest in the rehabilitation of the prisoners? And don't we pay for them to have programming to help facilitate their rehabilitation of prisoners? Right now, the parole board that we have has no interest in anyone, especially the lifers in prison. When all the other governors from Governor of, with the bow tie, who? What's his name? Soapy Williams, all the way up to William Milligan. They will be paroling at least 25 to 50 lifers a year. And none of them came back except 2, and they did not come back for another murder. Since England was in office, and on up to now, very few has been released. And all over the state of Michigan and all over the country, all governors state that the lifers are the best parole risk of any group of prisoners. But somehow that never reached the current parole board that we have here in Michigan. Can anyone on the panel explain that?
Well, I want to ask Justice McCormick about that, about 2 things in your comments and question there. I mean, you've looked at this recidivism issue in your work at the federal level in terms of corrections reform and evidence reform. First, to his question about the point at which keeping people in prison is no longer serves the function of protecting society. I mean, you've talked about the age at which people are no longer a risk.
There's a lot of data on that. Although there's also data on the lifers in particular, and I will say that in my last life, when I was a law professor, you guys used to invite me to come speak to you, and I spoke every single time you invited me. And Nolan, I recommend you do that. You would like this audience. It's a very good audience, and I think you should have them write to Nolan and ask him to come speak to them.
My agent.
He says yes to everybody. But there is actually a lot of data. Again, another opportunity for using data. I mean, I don't, at this point, I no longer make policy, but there's a lot of data about, after a certain age, the men's appetite for violence dies down considerably.
And a lot of other
and it's
things.
the testosterone, changes are good for us, are good for you all. So, but that's all. That is again another data source that we can use to make policies that help us make good decisions. But that's for my colleagues in another branch of government to figure out.
But the first part of his comments where he talked about being locked up for all those years for crime he didn't commit. Justice McCormick co-founded the Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan. Has done a lot of good work at uncovering cases where people were sent away for long periods of time for crimes they didn't commit. You're still working on, in your federal capacity, or you were on the commission, to get better testing techniques and past evidence reviews and what have you. And, along with letting people out in a timely fashion, not locking up the wrong people would go a long way to solving this problem.
Not locking up the wrong people is always a good thing, because if you locked up the wrong person, the right person is still out there, and I will tell you, they're probably committing more crimes. So it's probably better to get it right when we can. And this is another area where we now have a database from which we've been able to learn a lot about where the criminal justice system makes mistakes, because the DNA exonerations have given us about 1,000 pieces of data from which scholars have been able to study it, and we now know the kinds of things that go wrong and produce wrongful convictions. It helps us make better decisions. Certainly it helps people who make policy decisions, but it even helps courts, because we now know where things are likely to go wrong and where we need to take a closer look and do a better job. I always say, if you think of the criminal justice system like the rate of wrongful conviction is somewhere between 3 and 5%. If you think of the criminal justice system like throwing free throws and you only miss 3 to 5% of the time, you're doing pretty well. But if you think of it like landing planes and 3 to 5% of the time you're crashing, not so good, right? So it sort of depends on how you think of this system and what kind of...
But we're still too reluctant and too slow to admit we've made a mistake.
I love admitting when I make a mistake. It's my favorite thing to do. It's much better than digging yourself in a deeper hole.
Okay. Well, we're out of time. I got the signal, and I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience for being with us. Also, again, thanks to Michigan State University, WKAR, Detroit Public Television, and I hope you enjoyed both the presentation tonight and the panel. Thank you for being with us.